Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours. I'm Shauna Robeson with Creating Space Coastal. In this video, we are going to put all of those foundational techniques and lessons together to create a little winter wonderland in this heat spell. I don't know why. I went southern there. But anyway, we're going to be working on this winter wonderland in the middle of summer to practice all those skills that we learned over this past month. So if you're interested in finding out how, stay tuned. Let's get started. So I have the winter wonderland that we're going to be working on, and we're going to be using a lot of the techniques that we've talked about over the foundational series month. And the first one being some masking. So I'm just going to move this out of the way because I'm going to cut my masking for the trees. So I'm thinking about these trees right here. So I'm just going to cut some masking tape with an X-Acto knife. And make sure when you're doing trees to taper up so they start thicker at the bottom, and then they taper as they go up slightly. But make sure it doesn't go the other way. These are, can be fairly straight, but just make sure they don't start skinny and go wide. You don't want it to, because that's going to look unnatural. So just keep that in mind. Now, I've talked about this before. Usually you want to have your composition in odd numbers. So either make 1 tree or 3 trees or 5 trees. Now you can do whatever you want, creative license, but just as a little tip. I don't want one side to be straight, so I'm going to cut inside of that, and I'm not going to use that edge. And I'm just going to kind of angle down, and I want it a little bit jagged. I don't want it to be perfectly even. Now, if I cut from the top, I can use this as the base, so I can narrow it as I go down since I angled it up. So I can use the same piece. So I'm going to just make it a little bit narrower as I go down, because that's going to be the bottom of the tree and then the top of the tree for this one. And then I'm going to reverse that on this one. So I'm going to make this more slender and then go wider. Okay. If that makes sense. That way I can use as much of the tape as I possibly can. I just alternated my trunks. So I have these 3 pieces that I can use, and I can decide where I want them on my piece. All right. Now, make sure you run your fingers across them, and if there's any puckered edges, you want to make sure you press those down, or you could get paint behind there. So it's always good to just press them down with your finger and make sure you got a nice seal. So now I've got these trees masked out, the foreground trees, and then I want to save some white space back here. So what I can do here is add some masking fluid. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up a little bit of my masking fluid, since I have to thin mine. So I have my little synthetic brush that I'm okay if I get it a little. It's not my best brush. So let me grab a few things here. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wet the brush. Always wet the brush first. Then I'm going to put it in a little bit of soap. And I not want the soap, a big puddle of the soap or a big drop of the soap, but I want the soap in those bristles to keep that masking fluid from sticking to the bristles even more. So okay, so now I'm going to just think about, this is the tree line up here. I'm just going to, and I don't need to, well, some of them go all the way up the page. So I'm just going to think about where that tree line is. If you want to draw in a little pencil line, you can. I'm just going to eyeball it. Where they land, they land. And I want it really like wiggly, like a tree. Or some of them might be straight, like a birch. Some of them aren't all the way up. Doesn't have to be, you know, don't have to have a ton of them, but just, and make sure that they're not uniformly separated from each other. You're not trying to make it look like a bunch of lines. You want it to look real organic. All right. And now I have this baby wipe, so I'm just going to go ahead and wipe off as much of that as I can, and then I'll rinse my brush. And most of that, the actual fluid should be off of it once I've wiped it on the towel first. So then it should be okay. And then I'll rinse it and wipe it again. And just make sure that there's no residual masking fluid on your brush. All right, so now I have to let those dry. So typically the first thing that I would do is start with the sky. But I think because I'm letting that masking fluid dry, I think I'm going to come in here and lay down my little river first. So just imagine where your river is. You know, it basically, if you don't look at this as a river, if you just look at these as shapes, okay, this tree line starts over here. It's about a third up from the top of the this page, and it's a little bit further than a third on this side. So there's a little bit of a hill in the background. You don't have to have a hill if you don't want to, but just think about what this shape is. This is just a line, kind of like an elongated heart shape, okay? Don't try to think of it as a river because you're not in a perspective of seeing it as you would see a river. So don't let your brain confuse you. This whole section here is just, you know, just going to be a couple of inches high, and just wind your way a little bit of this into your snow areas to make it look like there's a river there, and then leave a little bit of white space in between the shapes. So this shape is, it just kind of trace the edge of the shape. It's going off the page, so we can imagine that the river continues. That gives it movement, but you can make your edge whatever shape you want. Just make it kind of amorphous. It's not really, you know, it's not geometrical, it's real organic. And just, we're going to add some color in. Okay. So I just wanted to start with that because I think it's easy to just start wanting to make it shaped like a river, how you would see it in the sky, but you're not seeing it from the sky. You're seeing it from the bank. So it's going to look a little bit different. All right. So I'm going to go in with, I think I'm going to use some burnt sienna and some ultramarine to get a nice deep, almost kind of like an indigo. I might even incorporate some indigo in there. Okay, I'm just going to check and see the color. I like that. That looks good. It's a nice sort of purpley blue-gray. Tells me it's cold. And now I'm just going to follow these shapes that I have. All right, now I have some kind of flowy river started there. I think I'm going to go ahead, because it's similar color, I'm going to put a couple of these rocks in here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of the sienna just to make them a little bit warmer so they're not exactly the same color. So I'm going to, in some areas, not close to where I put this in, but I can go in and create some shadows. And again, I don't want it to be exactly what that is. So this time I'm going to add a little bit of extra ultramarine blue to my mix. So it's a little on the purple side. And I just want to create some of those snow shadows to tell the story of the shape of the snow. See how there's a little bank here? That's all done just by how you shape the brush. That was all white originally. So you're telling the story by where you put some shadows and things like that. So, so we can create our own dimension, our own shape of the landscape just by what we add to it. So I'm going to start with wetting this area, not touching that area, just putting a little bit of water in over here, and then I'm going to touch in and create some shape, just soft. And if it's too much, I can water it down and just soften those even more. And I'm going to create some shadow around this boulder right here, just to imagine that there's some snow on top. And I don't have to, I can even use some of the pigment that's already there, just softening it up, brushing it up a little bit, and it'll give a little bit of like a shadow. This is mostly dry, so I'm just kind of softening those edges a little bit, bringing in a little bit of shadow. Now on the bank side, I'm going to imagine that the water is cut through some of the snow. So there's a little bit of, if you look at this painting, see how there's a little bit of like snow melted, like it melted into the snow a bit. So I'm just going to create that little bank. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but just basically what I can see from this angle. I want it real subtle. Oh, too much water. To make it, now this is more in the distance, so it's not going to be as obvious, but I'm just going to create a little bit of that on this one as well. Just a real subtle bank there. And then I'm just touching in a little bit of some just interesting shapes along the edge to just add just more texture and interest. All right, I think I'm going to go with a flat brush up here. I'm going to start with my sky. So I'm going to take a little bit of cerulean blue, which is a nice sky color, and maybe some cobalt. I'm not going to mix them together. I'm just going to lay them down. I'm going to lay one and then lay the other, kind of touch the other one in, so they're not necessarily mixed, but you get maybe a couple different tones of blue. So I'm just laying them on my palette ready to go. And then I'm just going to start at the very top, and I'm going to do kind of that wash. Do one, and then I'm going to dip into my other color, and then start back where I left off, dip into the first color, just kind of make an interesting sky there. All right. So all I need is really, this is going to be where my sky is most visible. So I'm making sure that that's It's wet, so I'm touching in a little bit of wet on wet, just a little more pigment and letting that mix and mingle. All right, now I'm going to go in and I'm going to start at the bottom and I'm going to create my tree line. And for this, I'm going to use a little bit of some sienna and maybe some my gamboge. So like it's like a deep yellow, just a yellow and some burnt sienna, because these are kind of fall winter colors, dead leaves back there. So a little bit of some warm yellow, a little bit of some sienna. I'm sorry, you can't see my mixing over here. I think I want a little bit of some cobalt in there just to tone it down a little for that tree line. And now I'm going to think about where I want my tree line to be. Am I going to make this a little bit higher and then bring it down over here? Whatever you want to do. I'm going to try to cover all of my masked trees over there. But I'm just going to basically put my brush down and then just create this dancing tree line. Oh, I'm getting too much water. I don't want to go have it bleed all the way up into my sky. So I'm staying pretty low with it. Okay, so I'm creating that tree line at the bottom, and now I'm going to get my gamboge, which is a real warm yellow, and I'm going to touch that in near the top. And anything that it touches in that blue, it could make it a little bit green, but you're not gonna get the bright greens, and it's getting fairly dry now up there, so I'm just dancing it around. Making my tree line. And now I can go in, I can add a little bit of some ultramarine. And this I want to be more at the bottom. And this is still kind of wet. So when I drop it in, it's gonna just do wet on wet. I don't want to run a straight line. I just want to dab it in there and let it do its thing. And it's going to make some grays, some greens, and give it a mixture of some texture in there. And now I'm going to try to get my brush as dry as possible. And so I want to do some dry brushing techniques up in the tree line with maybe some yellow ochre, just kind of, because I don't want it to be a solid line. So I'm just trying to create some softness in that tree line. And see how that just gives it a little bit of some interesting variation along the top of the tree line. All right, I've got that pretty well cooking in there. I can soften up if there's some, like, see how this tree line here has got some jagged edges that I don't necessarily love. I can just soften those up a little bit just by running my clean, damp brush along that tree line, just cleaning it up a little bit. All right, so I got that tree line going there, and I've got my whites that are still there. I've got this coming together. I want to deepen this a little bit more because it's a little bit pale for what I want. It always dries a little lighter. So I'm just going to go ahead and mix up another batch of my ultra and sienna. Actually, I'm going to add a little bit of, just to deepen it up a little bit more, I'm going to add my indigo, because indigo is kind of what this mix is going for, but I just have a ready mixed indigo that I can mix in there as well. And I'm just going to touch it back into those places. Now I might leave some of that lighter color in there. If I want some highlights in my water, I can do that. Hi everyone, just a gentle reminder, please don't forget to like and subscribe and share if you find this content helpful. All right, let's continue. Now I still have a little bit of little color, just a little tiny bit of color, and I'm just defining these shapes a little bit more. This little hill. I'd rather do it soft and then build up than have it be too much. It's too much, I can soften it. But I want to tell the story that this kind of goes up a little bit of a hill there. And then it's going to be even softer in the background because it's at more of a distance, but you can create some texture back there as well. Like if you just want to, show some flow, just gonna, maybe there's some little rises and hills going through there. So just to create a little bit of interest back there. Okay. Now, let's see how those are still wet. So I don't really want to do anything too much back in there while those are still wet. I could bring in a little bit of some darker tones before it's completely dry, but I got to be just careful not to make it too wet. It's already pretty wet. So I'm going to make a green, cobalt, and cadmium. I'm putting a touch of the burnt sienna in just to tone it down a little bit. Make it a little deeper subdued green. All right, let's see what that looks like in there. Just to maybe put some pines in. Yeah, it's still a little bit wet. Different heights, different shapes. Breaking up some, because you want to break up big shapes that are too big. So whether it's the negative space or the positive space, you're just breaking up those shapes, so you're just making it look like, oh, there's more things going on. I may not have exactly know what that is, but I don't want to have this huge orange ball. I want it to look like there's multiple things going on. So I'm just touching in, some color here and there. So I try to bring in the darker value towards the bottom of my trees, just to say, oh, there's a lot of shadows from all the branches and everything, just to tell that part of the story. It's like, oh, yeah, of course, there's shadows there. There's not a lot of light getting to that bottom area. I still want to break it up a little bit. I don't want it to be completely a black, but I generally keep keep the darkness low. I'm just like literally tapping, line, tap, just dancing the brush, not trying to be, I think sometimes we try to make it too uniform and that makes it look less organic that way. I could put detail if I wanted to, like I could draw some branches in there if I want. I'm actually going to try this. It might be too late, but I'm going to just put some, nope, I can do a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit of some light branches in just by using the corner of my cut credit card, just to show that there's some light highlights in some of these, just to give it some texture. Not everywhere. And you have to do that when it's almost dry, but not completely dry. If you do it when it's too wet, it has the reverse effect where the pigment gets in the valley of your scrape and then it creates darker shapes. And if you want darker shapes, that's fine. You can do that too. All right, let's see what we've got going on my foreground. I think I might be done with what I want to add back in here because I don't want that to be too much because that's in the background. So I think what I'll do is I can go ahead and I can remove these guys. And I could start working on all right. This is another good use for a credit card. And I'm going to mix up again another dark mix of the ultramarine, burnt sienna. Again, kind of like an indigo, so you can use indigo. And I'm going to dip the edge of this into my mix. And I'm going to come along the edge of the tree and I'm going to set it down and just run it like a little bit of a curve. And it's not going to set down everywhere, but see how I kind of make a little soft U? And see how it kind of dry brushes on the paper and gives it that look of bark. And you want to kind of give it a little curve because the tree trunk is round. So you're telling the story, this tree trunk is round. Now, you could also, if you didn't get everything where you wanted it, you could come in with I would actually use a flat brush. I'm going to use my flat brush because you can do the same thing with dry brush technique. Just make sure you don't have a lot of moisture or pigment on your paper. You want to have a nice concentrated color, but you don't want to have a lot of moisture. So get a nice saturated wash of puddle. And then you want to dab excess moisture off your brush. And then I'm just going to darken that edge a little bit more just to create that shadow of the trunk on that side. Now you can also just draw in a few, like if you have a place you feel like you didn't get enough, you can, touch in some lines yourself. Mix it up. The more messy it is, the more natural it's going to look. Mix up your color mixes, add a little bit more sienna, a little bit more ultra. You can, mix up those color tones a little bit. Now this is probably creating a little bit of a shadow on that side of the tree from this tree blocking it. So I'm going to put some shadow over here. And then you can do a soft shadow on the other side just to define that side of the tree. You know, see how there's no line there? So just make sure you have a pretty dry brush and just kind of dab in just to show where the, not everywhere, not a line, but just to tell the story that, oh, that tree's there. So I'm just tapping in some of this side of the tree. And if it's too uniform, like I don't like how this looks like a brush stroke, so I'm just gonna muck it up a little bit, either, you know, soften it or loosen it, or just kind of take that, mess it up so it's not so uniform. Make another, I think I'm going to use my Payne's gray. That's like my darkest tone. I want a little bit more shadow on the side. And you can just do that. Use your finger. Like if you set down a little bit of some paint, you can move it with your finger if you want. Give this snow around the base of this a little bit of some texture. For my branches, for these guys here, any of these branches, this is my darkest value and I want it really skinny. Now, before I can do the back, I have to make sure that that's dry, but I can do maybe some things over here. Yeah, I can't really do any branches up there, but I can do some little twigs and stuff down here. So I'm gonna use my script or my rigger, or you can use a rigger brush or something. It's got a really long, very small tip, so it's good for small, dainty lines. And I'm going to use my Payne's gray. I'm just kind of wiggling a little bit and sort of flicking up and wiggling. This might be a little bit wet here, so I don't know if it's going to work there. Yeah, some of that is wet, so that's not gonna. I can do branches here. Now, when you're doing branches, just keep in mind that they go from thick to thin, just like the trunk. So you don't want them to be real fat at the tip. So at the end, you'd lift up the brush. So thick, remember, press and lift. So if I press down, I get a thicker line. And then as I lift, I get a thinner and thinner line. And then usually at the end, I kind of flick and I get an even thinner line. So down, wiggle, and then flick. And you can get a nice organic shape. All right, I want to do a little bit, add a little more detail to these stones. I think they look a little kind of washed out a little. So I'm just going to go in with a little of my darkest. I'm going to mix that in with some of my ultra sienna mix. I'm going to mix some Payne's gray just to get that darker shade. And then I'm just going to create kind of some dark areas just so that the whole thing isn't the same color. I want to soften this shape a little bit. Kind of the underbellies of those rocks. And then I can, with a damp brush, I can soften the edge. Soften the edge. I'm just imagining the light coming this way, so I got a little bit of shadows from the trees. And I'm just seeing if I could just soften these edges a little bit on the banks. Just they're kind of harsh edges with just the pigment that's there. I'm not adding any more pigment. Just smearing a little bit. See if I can soften those. So let's see, how are we doing on this up here? It still feels damp. I did put a lot of water up there, so. And we know what happened last time when I tried to work on these a little bit too premature. It didn't go over too well. So maybe I'll play around a little bit more with the birch trees. Give it just a little bit more value. The more you can deepen the values or have the wide range of values, just the more dimension you get in your work. So, and that's what it is. It's just layering, adding a little bit more here and there. So you have several values in one piece, and it's just going to give it that much more of a realistic, organic feel. At some point you do have to be done, but sometimes we finish too soon too, and we just don't give it enough character. We just get afraid. I think sometimes it's like, oh, I don't want to mess it up. And I mean, you know, there's something to be said for that. But at the same time, if you can be brave and just go ahead and go, you know what, I'm going to add a little bit more. I mean, just look at the difference between those versus this. Because like I said, it always dries. It just gives it that much more dimension. So be brave. You can just always make another one, right? It's just paper, and see what happens. And the more that you explore, the more you learn. You go, oh, you know what? I should have quit then. Here's where I should have stopped. And, you know, you're going to make some mistakes along the way, but that's how you grow. That's how you get better. Trust me, I've made plenty of mistakes. Now, I don't like how dark that is right at the top at the edge of my page. That's, I would call a mistake. So I'm going to just see if I can lift that while it's still wet. You just don't want it to be a big black blob that takes your eyes off the page. It's always good to keep the eyes on the page. So you want to have your boldest statements within the main areas of the picture. You don't want to direct their eyes off. So it's always good to be subtle near the edges. Okay. I think this is fairly dry. So I'm going to add a few little brown twigs, some ochre and sienna, little dead branches maybe coming up out of the ground. Actually, I think I'm going to get my smaller brush because it's getting a little tricky to get the detail. And I'm going to use my synthetic because it's got the firm brushes, so I have a little bit more control. Still has a nice sharp point on it, but it's going to be, I'm going to be able to flick those little sticks out of the snow without too much trouble. Whereas if I have a softer bristle, it's going to be a little trickier. Just want to bring some of this color over here and balance it out a little bit by just adding it in a few spots. Oh, there's a little some reeds or something in the picture. I'm just going to add some of those over here. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to some of my darker hues and run those up over here as well. Mix those in. That's my ultramarine and burnt sienna or an indigo, those colors. Just righty. How are we doing? Yeah, it's really lifting up my page. So I think it's too wet. But basically, all I'm going to do at this point, I like the white in there. I'm going to touch in some dark. I think I'm going to have to, 8:37, I feel like I'm going to have to just maybe do that after class because I don't want to risk damaging the paper. And I just feel like, and this is the one thing you can't dry because, and the thing is it's not just the problem of the masking fluid drying, it's the paper needs to be dry so I don't tear up the paper trying to remove the masking fluid. So the only other thing I'm going to add in there is some of the dark branches around those. I'm going to put some of the bark in those trees and some details back there. But otherwise, one thing I do kind of want to, let's see if I can get, I kind of want a little bit of, I don't want that much. I want to kind of create a little bit more, like I want it to look like the worn, it's worn down that ice in layers. So, but I'll probably, futz around with it. Usually I like to put down my pieces for a little bit and then look at them later and then add additional things. But I think I've shown enough of, we did a wash. We did, of course, wet on wet. We did dry on or wet on dry. We did masking with masking tape and masking fluid. We also did the method of just technique of drawing around the white. So we did that in both here and here. And I could, if I lost some white back here, I could add it back with some gel pen or, other acrylics, but I don't think I'm going to do that because this doesn't need to be the main attraction either. We did dry brushing and we did lifting. So I think that, we did quite a few of those techniques that we learned. We did some color mixing. I tried to, instead of using greens, I tried to really mix my colors. And I think you get a more organic look with the color mixing if you do it that way, because you get some of the, parts of the mix showing through. And I think that that's really fun. We used the credit card to create some scratches up here to bring back some white. We also used it to create some texture here. And we worked on using a rigger brush. So quite a few techniques that we packed into this one little piece. So hopefully that helped for you to see it in action. And once I finish this, I will post the final piece. Hopefully I can get that masking fluid up without. Yeah, I definitely could feel like the paper is still wet up there, and that's the problem. So I don't want to damage it. Thank you everyone for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you find this content helpful. And as always, happy creating. Bye.